Okay, hello everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second. Okay, well, everyone is still coming in. I will give a brief introduction and a few housekeeping rules. Today, we are hosting a webinar with Reagan Communications Week on the findings from the 2022 IPR Disinformation in Canada report in partnership with McMaster and Leger. I'm Brittany Higginbotham. I'm with the Institute for Public Relations, and our panel today will be Dr. Tina McCorkindale, President and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. We also have Anetra Henry, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Institute for Public Relations. David Scholz from Leger, he is the Executive Vice President and Partner. And then last but not least, Dr. Terry Flynn, Academic Director at McMaster-Syracuse University, the Master of Communication, the Master of Communication Management. But before we begin, a few housekeeping rules. We are recording this webinar. We will have a dedicated portion to Q&A. However, please feel free to share resources, ask questions, and leave comments in the chat during the webinar. And we will, if you have any tech issues, feel free to message any IPR staff member, including myself. And let's see, I think we have a fun poll to try to gauge where everyone is from. And feel free to answer that during this time. But other than that, I think we can kick off the poll. Tina, I mean, the webinar. Tina, I can hand it over to you to begin.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Tina McCorkindale. I'm happy to be here today. Brittany, would you mind doing the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so what we wanted to do was kind of level set first what we are talking about to making sure that we understand what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation. As some of you may know, if you've attended previous webinars, IPR, that's one of our big areas of research, is specifically disinformation. So this is what we want to sort of gauge and make sure we level set. Now, we have a clear definition of what the difference is between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is false and misleading information. It's if somebody posted a wrong comment or said something that was incorrect. When we get into disinformation, that means that there is false or misleading information that is deliberate. That means that the sender has intentionally meant to mislead by the information that they provide. Now, you could get into spending a lot of time with the definition if you think like, well, does this person actually believe it? And is that misinformation or disinformation? But what we really want to focus on here is disinformation where there is some sort of harm on the part of the sender, or that there is some sort of negative impact the sender wants to have, that they want you to be deceived and they know that information is knowingly false. For IPR's purposes, we do focus on disinformation, but we do have some great resources with misinformation. And so you can check out some of our research we have on disinformation there, but we're focused more on people who have the intent to mislead. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so what I wanted to do is kind of get a sense, and we ask the same question in our research that we do, how much of a problem are each of the following in the US? So if we could launch the poll, and I want to specifically ask you, is disinformation in the news compared to other issues of the day, is that a major problem, minor problem, not a problem at all, or are you not sure? So we'll launch the poll and then we'll see what comes out of that. Okay, so how much of a problem is disinformation and misinformation in the news? I should do like the Jeopardy, like D, 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 D. All right, so I think everyone has had a time to answer. Let's see what the response is. All right, 89% of people said it is a major problem in the news. And I think, and what's really interesting, if some of you are researchers, that with everything that's going on with the election tomorrow, we're probably seeing some increases in that. All right, next slide, please. So here's why we should care about disinformation. And I don't know if anyone read the New York Times article over the weekend, but it was about Paul Pelosi's attack in San Francisco. And it was about the misinformation, well, I would say disinformation machines that were happening following the attack. There were accusations that Mr. Pelosi knew his attackers, that there was some prostitution scheme, that there was some sort of sexual relationship. There was all this negative, false disinformation that he was naked. I mean, there's all this very false misinformation with the purpose of trying to mislead. And it's hugely problematic because people who are considered politicians and trusted sources by some are spreading the disinformation. And you can see how that impacts society, democracy in general. But I'll tell you why you need to care about disinformation and why it's so important. In addition to eroding trust in institutions, which we know is extremely important, and we've seen that decline in the Edelman Trust Barometer, we've seen the decline in our own research. It also affects vaccine uptake. It affects people's perception of how the pandemic is prolonged. It affects our democratic processes and how our elections can be conducted. And it's not just US based, it's not just Canadian based, it's all over the globe. It decreases our effectiveness as a communicator. It increases polarization of our political parties. We also ask questions about mental health. And it affects people's, I mean, even reading that Paul Pelosi article, I could feel my heart rate increasing. And we see what's happening, the Russian war in Ukraine. They just found like mass graves outside of Mariupol. So you can see you can lose sales. Where I heard one story from a colleague about a fake Facebook post that people like boycotted, and it was just totally made up to spread disinformation, and it incites hate crimes. So there are significant impacts of disinformation that we have on society that we need to be concerned about it. And it's not just about Canada and the US, it's all over the world. And next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, which may be Mr. Scholz or Ms. Henry.
No, I'm ready to go here. So in light of everything Tina just talked about, and the fact that IPR has done a study with Morning Consult for 3 years now, looking at disinformation in the US, we wanted to take the questions and apply them to the Canadian population. So we did a survey this past spring, looking at cross-Canada poll of Canadians as representative as it can be with an online panel, and talked to 2003 Canadians about their views around disinformation and who they trust. And next slide, please, Brittany. One of the things, it's interesting, this group that's in the webinar today is obviously, we're a little biased or skewed in a particular direction. So 89% of you said it's a significant issue. Overall, we found that 78% of Canadians, and in the Morning Consult piece, it was 67% of Americans feel that disinformation is a problem right now. So in the scope of it being a problem, who are we trusting for our information? Who do we trust for our news source? The number one in both Canada and the US is our family. So people like me, friends, family, people who are around me are who I generally trust, slightly more in the US than it is in Canada. But the most interesting one that comes out of this is the local broadcast news. Much higher in Canada, 9% higher than it is in the US. And consistently across Canada, even without the local broadcast news, the national network, CBC, is very highly trusted. It's at 68% across Canada. And the thing about Canada is we still trust our national networks more than Americans trust their national networks. So CBC is at 68%, CTV is at 66%. If I go to the US, the ABC, NBC, CBS group, that's between 52 and 54%. So I'm trusting CBC high, I'm trusting my local broadcast news, but I'm not necessarily trusting journalists. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. So who amongst that group are we really trying to learn from? And we're also seeing differences in opinions depending on what political viewpoint you have. So liberals are most likely, people who say they would vote liberal are more likely to say their top trusted source is local broadcast news. If I'm a conservative supporter in Canada, I'm more likely to say it is people like me or family that I'm going to support. So we start to have some disparate results coming in. depending on political slant, depending on age, depending on education, throughout all these results. Next slide, I'm going to hand it back over to Anetra for a second.
Thank you, Dave. So with that question, on top of looking at what our most trusted sources are, we definitely took a look at who our least trusted sources are. And we see a lot of similarities between Canadians and Americans with a little variance on those. But by and large, we don't trust in North America, between America and Canada, the Russian government, the Chinese government, Facebook, and Fox News all made it as the top in the top 5 in both countries. But you definitely get a chance to see here that Canadians are a little bit more distrustful of the Russian and Chinese governments than Americans are. But also, if you're getting your news from celebrities, this is another group of people that, as North Americans, meaning Americans and Canadians, for this study, that we're not trusting our celebrities to give out trusted sources of information as well. TikTok is another one that entered when we took a look at the disparity of year over year on the American study. It rose in terms of being a least trusted source. That is definitely interesting because if you look at ages, a lot of the younger generation tends to derive their information from social media channels, and TikTok has definitely come to the top of that place for younger people over the last few years. Next slide, Brittany. When we took a look at who's responsible for spreading disinformation, Americans and Canadians agree that politicians have a good hand in spreading disinformation, as well as the Russian government. Though there's a bit of disparity between Americans and Canadians on this, they definitely agree that politicians and the Russian government, by and large, are responsible for spreading disinformation. You could take a look here, but when you see marketers, advertisers, celebrities, and again, these different news outlets are responsible for spreading disinformation, and both Americans and Canadians agree on this. Next slide. We also took a look at who does well combating disinformation. And it's interesting to go back to Dave's point about when we look at who the trusted sources are, and people feeling like people like themselves, their friends and family are their trusted sources, they also feel that way about who's doing well combating disinformation. If you take a look at these numbers, there's just a mild variance of 6% between Americans and Canadians here. But by and large, we feel like people like us that tend to think like us do well at combating the disinformation. But again here, the local broadcast news in both countries tend to be a more trusted source, as well as doing a better job combating disinformation. Next slide. When we think about who should be responsible for combating disinformation, Americans and Canadians agree that our president, our leaders, president, prime minister, should be responsible, as well as our journalists. They should be. Whether or not they are is a different story, as you can see by the news outlets, which sources journalists are. We tend to believe that they should be responsible, but we definitely have some variance on if they are doing a good job of that. Next slide. And then the ability to recognize disinformation. Canadians and Americans kind of have a variance here about whether or not they're confident in doing that. Americans tend to be more confident in their ability to recognize disinformation, and with somewhat confidence, definitely being higher with Canadians than Americans. But we're definitely seeing that disinformation is having a large impact in society, where we're not necessarily as confident as we used to be about our ability to recognize that something is false and deliberately misleading us. Next. This is definitely a very interesting part of the study on how often people come across disinformation. Almost at once a week, you've got about almost 70% of Americans coming across disinformation, as well as Canadians, that it's impacting us. And I'm sure David's going to get to that in the next slide. But if you take a look about how often disinformation is being spread across different channels, whether that's through the people that we know or social media networks or the news themselves, we're definitely encountering it as Americans and Canadians far more than we probably should be. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dave.
Thanks, Anetra. And one of the things that Anetra talked about was how often you see it and who should be responsible for fighting disinformation. It wasn't on the earlier slide, but 70% of people feel that we ourselves should be responsible. You know, the respondents said they should at least be somewhat responsible to fight disinformation. So given that in mind, so if a lot of us think that we're supposed to be responsible ourselves, what are we actually doing about it? And you see here, in terms of the number of people that are checking sources before they share information, 89% are saying at least sometimes. 35% and 38% in the US are saying that they are always or often checking sources before they share. Next slide, please. And a large part of that is that we're just not sharing on a regular basis, at least in Canada, information on social media that comes from news or news outlets or other media. But when we are sharing it, we don't necessarily check all the time those sources. And we are less likely to check sources the older we are. We are we're more likely to share sources the younger we are. So our experience with social media comes into play in a large part on this. Next slide. And beyond that, so not only are we not sharing it, we're avoiding media and news because of disinformation. So 28% of Canadians say that they are actively avoiding information online because of this. It's much larger in the US. And an interesting side note here is we also asked people, are you no longer looking for news in your country? In other words, are you going outside the country for news because you can't necessarily trust the news that you're getting within your own country? 16% of Canadians said that they are looking outside their country for news because they can't trust the Canadian news. This is double in the US. It's at 30% of Americans look for information and news outside their country because of disinformation. So that level of trust is really a direction, and we don't have trend numbers on Canada. We'll do this study again. We'll see if that number starts to increase. But you know, generally, we as Canadians, if we're going to move from that 16% more towards the American approach, that's not a good news story when it comes to trust of local media. And then the last slide is we wanted to understand is just to what degree do we see disinformation as a threat? So earlier on, I said 78% of Canadians feel that this is definitely an issue for us. 72% feel it's a threat to democracy. And disinformation undermines election process is about 71% in Canada, 73% in the US, and with the elections coming up tomorrow, this is certainly a topic of interest. We also agree between Canada and US that it increases the polarization of political parties. And it's really interesting, a lot of our results, when we compare along the political spectrum from New Democrats, liberals, conservatives, all the way down to people who would identify as the People's Party of Canada voters, there is a definite difference of response to issues around COVID, to issues around who do you trust, to issues around who do you distrust within the media. So there is definitely a polarization, not just in the US, but also in Canada here. Where we're a little bit different so far is in infringing on human rights. Canadians, it's still 56%, it's still a high number to be concerned about it, but it's not as high as Americans' concern around this. And Tina touched on this, that level of emotion or that level of anxiety or stress that disinformation brings to us, 40% of Canadians have acknowledged that this is something that impacts them. Much higher in the US at 12% higher. And then the last one was sort of the opposite sides of it is all this talk about disinformation exaggerated? 19% of Canadians feel so. So we have 72% saying it's a threat. We have 19% saying it's exaggerated. It's not, it sort of makes sense on those results. But I find that US number of a quarter of Americans feeling it's exaggerated, which is the exact group beyond those who say it's a threat. So it's a polarization of views even within these results. And I'm going to throw it on to Terry.
Oh, great, Dave. Thank you, Dave. So, why is this happening? And what can we do about this? And I think we go back to theory and some of the work that psychologists have done to really pinpoint what is going on in society. And I think Dave's last slide is really important, that people understand this to be a significant threat to democracy. And so we should be concerned about it. At the same time, this concern increases our level of anxiety. We were just talking before this session went on. Dave and I are here in Canada. Tina and Anetra and the IPR staff are in the United States. There's an election that's happening tomorrow in the United States that will have significant consequences. I feel anxious. Now, I may feel anxious because I spend more time watching it as well, but other people are feeling anxious. So theory will help us discover why some of this happens. Well, disinformation has a big anchor on it because for most people, it means that we have to spend time thinking about it. And if we're anxious about it, we try not to think about it. And so we look at exemplars, or what we would call heuristics, shortcuts in our brains. We want to find somebody that we trust. And if they have a point of view on it, then in fact, we'll adopt their point of view. And that's because that when we are dealing with such contentious issues or challenging information, and some of this information could be challenging in our own worldviews, we most of us try not to spend enough time cognitively analyzing the issues as we see fit. Some people will just say, look, I'm not going to talk about it. It creates a great deal of anxiety and concern about me. So I'm just going to adopt the point of view others are doing it. So that saves the brain's energy. And so we can utilize that saving to look at other things that are much more important or satisfying for us as well. So there's this notion of cognitive laziness. It doesn't mean that people are, lazy. They just don't want to expend the necessary energy or have the deep connection to the issue to really go deeply on it. And so they will accept misinformation or disinformation from a trusted source and accept it as what it is. Next slide. Where that has a concern for us is that even with organizations combating, and so whether that's the trusted sources that we have or local broadcasters or anybody else trying to combat this misinformation, people tend to say, well, maybe there's a hint of truth there, right? Maybe I don't believe it's all disinformation. Maybe there's something about what's happening in the Nancy Pelosi case, or kind of reminds me of that pizza place in DC that was accusing of Hillary Clinton and others to have a sex ring involved with it as well. People will say, well, I don't trust politicians. They don't always tell us the truth. So there must be a little, where there's a little bit of smoke, there's got to be fire to it. And so this notion of illusionary truth is critical because they will, if we don't combat it completely, we will in fact find ways to adopt that sense of misinformation. And then it becomes familiar. And then we in fact take it as a given, and it entrenches it within our own belief system that there is in fact some level of truth to this as well. Next slide. So why does this happen? And I always return to my favorite two psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Avi Tversky, who have been thinking up until Tversky's death in the 90s, but from the 70s through today, and Kahneman's work as well, have been thinking about these kind of dilemmas, these decision points, why people make certain decisions as well. And it really stems down to how we respond from a neuroscientific standpoint, right? much of the cognitive laziness would in fact relate to the first reactions, right? We look at people that we trust, it's automatic, it's impulsive, it's something that we feel like we've got some kind of connection to it. It's almost unconscious. And so that's what it is, right? We set up this reaction. And so this is what Tversky and Kahneman talked about, this system one way of thinking, very automatic. The illusionary truth, or to combat cognitive laziness, takes a lot more thinking, takes a lot more cerebral brain power on certain issues as well. And so that takes time. It is a conscious effort. It has to be rational and logical. And sometimes people just don't, in fact, spend that time. So where we, in fact, land on these issues depends on the degree to which we want to really think about these issues as well. Next slide. So just again, if you've looked at Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast and slow, you'll know, in fact, that people that have a more desire to think slower on these issues are going to spend more time and focus and given their own agency. If they think fast about that, they turn their own personal agency or choice over to somebody else that they might in fact trust. And so we have to understand why people are making these decisions in order to be able to break through with this. Because what people will naturally do is that when they are confronted with an oppositional point of view or perspective or disinformation, we talk about this notion that they will in fact face their own internal wall of resistance. Next slide. And so this wall of resistance that we've discovered, it really depends on whether or not somebody will be available cognitively to change their point of view, right? Or even open to listening to differing points of view as well. So in our research that we've done with our Behavioral Insights Research Center at IPR, we identified 8 different factors of resistance that are present when somebody is confronted with oppositional or differing perspectives, or even a motivation to change a point of view as well. And so so the strength of this wall of resistance will be in fact a predictor of whether or not people will adopt a different point of view or are open to listening to different points of view as well. And so I won't go through the whole notion of it as well, but in fact, whether it's their own personal norms and biases, this is my echo chamber, this is my group, I don't want to go outside of my in-group. That's why, in fact, I'll resist that even listening or adopting or accepting different points of view. Whether or not I have any self-efficacy, right? And many of us would feel that way as well, right? If change comes tomorrow in the United States, you might say, well, what's the point, right? There is forces at work that I have no control of. I can't do anything about it. So I'm not even going to try to challenge different points of view as well. So these are the kinds of things that you look to theory or research to be able to test in identifying these perspectives. And I'm going to throw it back over to Dr. McCorkindale.
Oh, it's me. Hi, everybody. I was, of course, typing in the chat, so here I am. Thank you, Dr. Flynn. Appreciate that. All right, so we thought that before we get into the great Q&A that Anetra will lead, is like, what can you do? It's just a little, I know tomorrow for us and for our friends to North as well, like the elections are very stressful for tomorrow, and you see all the disinformation that's posted. And I said earlier that I sort of feel like my heart rate increasing when I sort of experience disinformation. It gets really frustrating. So let's talk about what organizations can do. All right, next slide, please, Brittany. So the first thing is, organizations spend a lot of time on their professional development programs. How should we educate our employees? What do they need to know? That's about the business. Well, how to be able to interpret information should be about the business. When we ask these questions of Americans or Canadians or whoever it may be, they are employees. So how can we get our employees to be better citizens? And as you know, a lot of the research shows is that people have expectations that companies are stepping in where maybe the government isn't doing as well as they should. So one thing would be to teach media literacy courses and to train employees. At IPR, we have experts. I mean, Terry showed his great wall of resistance and some of the how people process information. And he's also the director of our Behavioral Insights Research Center. Dave Scholz will take that over. So there are some great resources about media literacy and helping employees and find out how people think and how they evaluate information. So one thing is helping employees understand like how to evaluate sources. So next slide, please. So here's a great example, and this is something that Dr. Flynn wrote, and it's 10 ways to combat misinformation. It's a behavioral insights approach. So it talks about biases, it talks about the wall of resistance, it talks about what we need to think about when we're sending out information. Do you repeat disinformation? How does repetition affect it? How does it spread? I mean, there's all such, this is a wealth of material, and I know that Olivia will drop a link to this in the chat, so highly suggest this. And then next slide, please. We also have a really great 10-point checklist that we'll also drop into the chat, but it basically says, what is something that people should know? And we call it the think before you link. That before people share information, how do they evaluate it? How do they know that it's shareable? Because even if people post some information on social media, it typically is shared by other people. So I want to break this down a little because I think it's really important. A couple of years ago, before COVID, MIT released a really fascinating study about how disinformation is spread on Twitter. And what they found is disinformation is spread at 6 times a faster rate than regular information. And if this was a conversation, we would have more interaction about why do you think that is? And you're more than welcome to add that to the chat if you have theories yourself. But there's a couple of reasons why that is. One is disinformation is designed to make you angry. Disinformation is designed to get your blood pressure up. It's usually very emotional. It's usually angry. And that is what gets you to share disinformation at a faster rate, which is exactly what people, the bad actors who are creating disinformation, they want you to do, because that's how it sows division, is that's how it commits to polarization. So that's why it says, does it create distrust or sow division? That's what it's designed to do. And how does it make me feel? So those are the different areas of how to evaluate information. Now, I will also say, if you read that New York Times article, which is fantastic, and I can drop it in the chat, is they had one of the experts on that was Nina Jankowicz, who was the very brief head of the Center for Disinformation that was appointed by Biden's administration that only lasted 3 weeks due to disinformation taking it down. But Nina talked about that it doesn't even matter about the Paul Pelosi. You could have camera footage, but it's made up. It's so hard to tell then what will convince people with facts and information and what actually moves people to change their mind. So this is a great checklist, and I highly suggest that you all share it with your employees. And, we're always happy. IPR is all in the business of education and research, and we're happy to come in and talk to your teams as well, or even do a media literacy series. So it's really critically important. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's another example of why theories are so important. Theories are not facts, but they're guides for behavior. So it talks about how do you inoculate against disinformation, which basically states that if you warn people, especially they've done this a lot with climate change, that there's disinformation surrounding XX topic, it helps people be ready to encounter disinformation and do something about it. And by the way, fast reaction is also critically important with disinformation. Here's techniques of science denial and how people do it. So it's the more you know, the better you're well equipped. And then there's also this integrative complexity theory, which talks about how people accept ideas and how willing people are to accept ideas rather than leading and thinking for themselves. And this is a trainable leadership qualities of how you make people better leaders by having that more self-transforming mind rather than a socialized mind that adopts what other people say without having the ability to go and do additional research or find additional information. Next slide, Brittany, please. Thank you. The other thing is, and this is really important, is a lot of organizations and companies support from however they do it. They support sources that share disinformation. And it's in their advertising portfolio. They lobby and support people who spread disinformation. And the way that you're going to hit and make a change is through dollars and money. And what's going to come out is it's going to appear on some sort of list. Remember the list from the Yale professor after like who was supporting Russia versus Ukraine with the dollars. It's going to come the same way that people are going to find out how much was given to this source and this source, and it creates, that's another sort of preventable crisis that can happen. All right, next slide, please. This is a quick example of how also inadvertently that ads can come up, because typically people will buy ad packages and be selling ads on the sites. So this shows just an example of it. Also, sources, what they do is they fake pull in sites and fake pull in. So that also has to do with like supporting how we're supporting people who are hosting sites, et cetera, social platforms and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. The other thing is, when we do our study, we ask about how trustworthy is your employer, how trustworthy are organizations, and you can get that from our study. But it's also being a trusted source of information. It doesn't mean that you have to say, we are the CDC and here's what we have, but it is saying like, these are approved sources for getting information. The other thing is set a good example and cite sources. So if you're talking about research, if you're talking about a study, always cite your sources like a good grad student should, or a good researcher should, because that is really important as well. And so every time you say, this is what's happening in the economy, this is what's happening there, like citing the sources helps build credibility for those sources. And it also shows that we care about citing sources, we care about attributing our research, and then we expect our employees to do the same thing. And here's how you go and find it. Next slide, please. All right, so here's like a great example. And then pulling out sources like USA Facts, which by the way, I love it because their data is displayed very cleanly. They give you general information, but this isn't necessarily, this is like, here's some really great data that you could use. But what USA Facts is they take government from all the different government organizations and government sites, and they put together very cleanly organized data. So it's easy to find, easy to understand, and easy to pull. So if you were going to say, and that's also about being good governance, instead of saying, this is what we're worried about the economy, like be very specific as to what you're talking about and what's the source. So like, according to XXX, these are the potential implications from it. This is what we're prepping for. And then it just shows that you're actually a better researcher as an organization as well. Next slide, please. All right, and then a lot of companies also have policies for how they deal with disinformation when it comes on there. So like Google, for example, they do have a policy for disinformation and how they handle it. So I just wanted to show this, whereas others maybe don't have a policy for how they handle disinformation with certain topics. And that is very disturbing. So if anyone does business with some of these other companies, it's pushing them to make sure that they do, and that's via the dollars that you spend with them. Next slide, please. So the other thing that's really important is to have a proactive crisis response plan. How are you going to deal with crisis, and what are you going to do? It's this disinformation mission, because it's going to hit everyone. If it hasn't hit people on the site, it's going to hit. It could be a benign Facebook post that gets shared all over the place, or it could be someone says the dollars from this donor are coming in, and then all of a sudden everybody's boycotting you. You have to have a disinformation plan in place with your crisis plan. And then how do you address it? I think we also have this tendency to say, well, let's see how it's tracking in the media. What is it going to spike and then it goes away? But by that point, it's a little late. It's a little late. So you have to say, how are we going to combat it and stop it? And how are we a source of truth? Next slide, please. So this is a great example of how some US agencies and international agencies have come up and developed plans for disinformation and what they're going to do, right? So we have the European Parliament, the Council, they have a disinformation plan of what to do. And then you have the US Agency for Global Media, which is a lot of different organizations together that also has a disinformation program or a code of practice, because it's just going to get worse from here. if organizations aren't doing something about it or actively combating it and not saying, well, it's really up to the media to combat what people are saying, then it's time to do that now and say, how can we be a source of truth for our employees? Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide. Basically, I'm saying you have to fight against it. But there's different things, and this is where we pull in media literacy, that it's not just a matter of saying, here's the corrective information if you want it. There is science to how to go about combating disinformation. We have some of that science within the 2 guides that I talked about earlier, but we also have a great resource on our Burke that can talk about, here's the best plans of debunking messages that is based on research and not Tina McCorkindale's opinion, because we know that no one cares about that. But I have research-based ideas for what we should do. So one thing is, right, if you have corrective information, you have to have strong evidence, but you also have to think about the emotional aspects as well. You can give facts all day, but how does it tie to individuals and how does it make them feel? Now, it says without adversarial tone, but I'll tell you that that doesn't always work per the research. So, but one thing that is important, and this is also what Dr. Flynn says in the guide about combating misinformation, is that when you repeat disinformation over and over, it increases believability. And people eventually also forget the source, and then they repeat the disinformation, but they can't remember the attribution to the source. So this is very important, that you don't want to keep repeating disinformation, but you want to stick with the facts and make sure that these are research-based and that it's following through. So with that, there's a lot of theory and a lot of research that there's access to over how to behave. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of the last things I'll advocate for, and this is supporting local journalism. This is really important. In both Canada and the US, it came out that local sources were some of the most trusted sources, despite the differences of political parties. So there's a lot of pro-journalism legislative bills, there's training programs, which you talked about media literacy, and also helping journalists and training journalists. But supporting local journalism through funding, ads, and subscriptions, it's the only place that Republicans and Democrats come together as a trusted source that is a media-based source. It is local journalism. And next slide, please. As you can see, Dr. Penelope Abernathy, I admire her greatly. She has done a lot of work since 2005 on news deserts, and these are places that may not have a local newspaper. And this is where the sources are trusted the most. So you can see that you can look at the picture here and say, there are places that don't have any newspapers and some that only have one newspaper, usually a weekly. Since like 2005, we've had like 1,500 to 1,800 newspapers that have gone away. And it's because they don't have the funding model there. They're not getting the funding. So that is something that organizations can help do. Next slide, please. And then support organizations and nonprofits like IPR that we support media literacy, combat disinformation, service fact checkers. Like First Draft is another good example. There's a lot of nonprofits out there doing good work to hopefully bring to the forefront of what we can do. I think that is my last slide, maybe, Brittany, sort of. Oh, I'm here. This is a great opportunity for you to drop other suggestions in the chat of what you think that organizations can do, maybe what your organization is doing. And we're happy to include those and give you full credit, of course, because that's what we do as a research organization. So without further ado, I believe I'm turning it over to Anetra Henry to guide us through a Q&A. And don't forget to keep putting questions in the chat because we love hearing ourselves speak. So there you go. Anetra. It's yours.
Tina.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Terry, for an informative presentation on the comparison study between the US and Canada. As a person who participated in the research aspect of this, particularly around the American study and then comparing the numbers, one of the things that surprised me the most was the number of people who are being negatively impacted by encountering disinformation. To realize that over half of Americans and 40% of Canadians are feeling anxious or feeling stressed when they encounter disinformation was really eye-opening for me, because we also have this new wave of mental health crisis and public health crisis that takes place in both of our countries due to residual effects from COVID and other things that are just happening in daily life. So Dave, I'm going to start with you and I want to ask you this question. what finding from these studies was the most surprising to you? And anything else that you want to share about the impact on public health, particularly in Canada?
Yeah, and that is the finding that's the most interesting, is how public health information falls into the whole disinformation sphere and how people view it differently from a political, from a regional, from an educational perspective. And there was a question asked on the Q&A chat about, basically for some people, what I view as disinformation might be the truth to them, and what they view as disinformation might be the truth to me. So we wanted to measure that a little bit, and we asked a few questions around COVID-19, not surprising. And about 3/4 of Canadians, regardless of political spectrum, believe there is much disinformation around COVID-19 vaccinations. And then we asked about mask wearing, and we said, does wearing a mask prevent the spread of COVID-19? 68% of Canadians would agree with that. Interestingly, if you're liberal or Democrat, New Democrat, you're more likely to agree with this. 83% of liberals would agree with wearing a mask helps to prevent COVID. But if you're from the conservative side, it drops down to 59%. If you are from the even further right, People's Party of Canada, it drops down even further. So let's reverse that. And let's say wearing a mask does not prevent the spread of COVID-19. When I ask it that way, 30% of conservatives agree and 13% of liberals disagree. So this whole perspective of what is disinformation makes this a very hard thing to combat. And before we go too far down from a polarization standpoint, where I only trust these sources and I trust them regardless of what they say, versus I distrust these sources and whatever they say I don't believe, that's a scary road to go. So that's why Tina's points about how to combat this, Terry's points about what to think about, and how do we train our employees and our own selves and people around us to combat it now, before we get to this point where, Anetra, whatever you say, I'm not going to believe, whether you're saying the truth or not, and I'm not going to check your source. So that's where we're at politically, at least in Canada, on some of these, especially public health topics.
Tina,
Yes.
same question.
Yeah.
What in the studies, in the disinformation, either America or the Canadian version or the comparison, was the most interesting or surprising finding to you? And anything that you want to add on the effects on public health?
Sure. So I thought very similarly to Dave about the trustworthiness of sources in America versus Canada, and the fact that we don't have an overall trusted source, media source in the US, right? Canada does. Like they're like CBC, it's up in the 70s. So you have the different political parties within Canada that support this. We don't have the same thing in the US. And it's what Dave said, that, you believe certain sources, like anything that comes out of the mouth of X person, we're not going to believe it, doesn't matter. And this is where the challenge is. And I've always sort of suspected that about Canada based on like some of the documentaries I've watched. But the other thing that's really interesting, and I know Dr. Flynn would appreciate this, is when we did IPR, we ran the research on the Dialogue Project. If you aren't familiar with that, it was a study that was looking at how we can engage in civil discourse and dialogue with one another, especially in light of what we've seen with polarization it was specifically in the US and political parties. But one of the questions we asked was about the third person effect. And the third person effect basically says that I don't think I'm influenced, but I absolutely think other people are influenced. So we asked questions to sort of gauge the third person effect with that study, saying, how do you perceive polarization in civilized discourse? Do you feel like you're responsible, or do you think others are more responsible for like disinformation and not having civilized discourse? And the third person effect was well in. It was absolutely like, well, me, I'm so accepting of other ideas, but so-and-so over here isn't. And I assume that a lot of people would we didn't ask this, but it would be interesting to add it in there, is to test the third person effect, whether people believe that they are responsible for spreading because we don't say, how much are you responsible for spreading disinformation? Which I know that in the Canadian study, we did ask about personal responsibility, but that's really interesting. And then how responsible do you think people, others, not you? And I bet we would see the third person effect. People don't have a personal responsibility. And in the Canada study, it did show that people don't believe that they're personally responsible. But every other source that we ask, people do think everyone else is personally responsible. So I think that's surprising. The mental health thing isn't surprising. I think it's stressful for every political person, because what they see as the opposite side is what the disinformation is, right? So that was a long answer, but there you go.
Thank you, Tina. Dr. Flynn, same question to you. What was the most surprising finding in these studies for you? And what do you think are the significant impacts on public health?
Well, hard to follow up on both Dave and Tina when they've hit it off. They've hit all these points really importantly. I think it's the weaponization of information and the politicization of information that I believe is in fact the most surprising. And, make no mistake, that Tina points well that CBC does have a higher level of trusted source. And, it's hard to compare because the United States doesn't have a publicly funded media outlet. But there are still conservatives and right-wing politicians that don't believe in the CBC as well. So we are now seeing, I think, again, this kind of coalescing into our own in-groups, and that we only believe trusted sources that our in-group believes in, and that the third person effect is that we're okay over here, whatever my group is, but when you look over across the street and see those other people, you shouldn't trust any of their information as well. So that I think is it. The politicalization of the information packet that Canada is seeing through this study is getting to be similar to what's happening in the United States. And my biggest fear is that we won't be able to sort of bridge that divide, and that we will, in fact, be in a place where as Dave said, doesn't matter what you say or do, I'll never, ever, 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 ever believe you. And that's not healthy for democracy.
Absolutely. We have already had some great questions come through our Q&A portal, and I'm going to start with one of those. And Tina, I'm going to throw this one to you first, and then we'll go around. Do you think the emphasis on local journalism can be attributed in part to proximity bias or something else?
Yes, I believe that question was from Catherine Blades. Happy birthday, Catherine. It was her birthday this weekend, and I won't sing, but everyone would be delighted that I don't. But yeah, absolutely. So proximity bias is how the location where you are based lends some sort of bias that happens. And that's exactly the case. So if you think about local journalism being a trusted source, it's most likely still skewed and very influenced by the companies that you're pitching to. So even though it's really important to support your local journalism and local news, it's still skewed. So then it becomes, well, what is the source of information? I also think that this isn't related to that, but I think op-eds are also problematic a lot of times for news organizations. Even though I love reading them and they're really great and I love to see people's opinions, I think people cloud that. So if you read a really pro-conservative, pro-liberal op-ed, it's very hard to take that and distance that from the news that is within the newspaper as well. So that's sort of also, that may be controversial, but that's sort of my also thought. So,
Terry, Dave, do either of you have anything you want to add to this question? Do you think emphasis on local journalism can be attributed in part to proximity bias, or is it something else?
Well, I just familiarity as well, that you see these people in your community and you might interact with them at community events, different things. So it's more real to me. And so when as opposed to seeing some of these national news reporters or, writers in the New York Times, I'll never meet the people that write for the New York Times, but I coached against a guy that his kid played hockey on another team. So I know that person. And so I think that's important. I think we also have to be very wary is that, these local resources are being starved. And, they're in some respects, from a newspaper standpoint, what you're seeing, especially in Canada, is that there has been a convergence of newsrooms in central places, and you're getting more local news from other local sources than your own backyard as well. So I think there are some things to watch. I have to tell you, though, I was just watching my local news the other night, and they were talking about a holiday fair that had happened, in businesses getting together. And as I watched this, I said, stop, go backwards. And somebody said, I'm dreaming of a white CHIRSTMAS. They can't even spell. There you go. So be careful. That's how the resources, but it wasn't the journalists that did this. It was the people that were selling these crafts.
And I'm just going to jump in. It's a little bit like that. I trust my friends and family. And to Terry's point, the local people are friends, family, people who I'm familiar with. So I trust who I'm familiar with. In our study, for example, in Western Canada, one of the news sources that skews higher is a news source called Rebel News, which is very much politically affiliated with the right or farther right of our Canadian political stream. So that's who I'm trusting, because that's who I see in my regular recurrence. So we do have to be careful what local knows means, but it means when we're communicating as communicators and putting messages out, know that those local publications are trusted, and it's a way to get it to the population that's reading that or watching that behind that.
Awesome. We have a question from Elizabeth Hurst. She says that she finds it interesting that Canadians seem more skeptical than Americans about news sources and more trusting of the governments. Any idea as to the factors that cause this difference? And of course, I'm going to ask Dave and Terry to weigh in on this first. And then Tina, if you have anything to add, please jump in.
I'm going to go back to some work that Terry and I did almost 15 years ago now, looking at the importance of social responsibility and reputation between Canada and the US. And we found that in Canada, it was a little bit less important, primarily because we rely on our government, for good or for bad. We rely on our government more than Americans rely on the government. And you tend to rely on businesses from a social responsibility standpoint more, from a health, from a well-being perspective. So I think part of that taps into that, just the closeness that we have with our government system, our healthcare system, and the way it moves along. I think that's part of it, but there is less trust now than in the past. Let's be clear on that. Terry, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, first of all, thank you, Betsy, for that question, and good to hear from you. Yeah, I think it goes to the fact that Canadians generally view government as a good thing, where Americans would view government as a pain in the ass, and that is a necessary evil. But we believe we have publicly funded healthcare, we have publicly funded education, we have publicly funded public health systems as well.
Now you're just bragging, Terry. Now you're just bragging.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. But I think so governments and CBC being a government funded agency, would have a higher rate of credibility because it is not private sector, it's not privatized, and it does. They're not beating to the drums of the stock market in that respect.
Tina, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
No, I just thought the Canadians could do it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
The next question that we have is from the amazing Treaty Puraburami. She says she is curious about the ways to share these findings with our North American communities whose first language is not English. In particular, she's seeing a lot of disinformation regarding the current women, life, and freedom movement in Iran, being shared by North American Iranian communities. One reason this is concerning is that Iranian Americans are basing their vote in the USA based on this disinformation. Tina,
Yes.
I'm going to kick this one to you. Do you have any ideas about ways to share this in communities whose first language is not English?
Yeah, so I know that a lot of the Amini protests happening right now in Iran and all, and it's very worrisome. So when we talk about disinformation in the US, sometimes I think we forget about some of the life and death impacts of disinformation around the globe, like what we're seeing in Iran right now. And we saw this also with COVID, during COVID, and how a lot of disinformation killed a lot of people in the US and around the world as well, like in Brazil. So I think for this, it's who are trusted sources of information and what can be done for those sources. So when we saw, especially with some of the uprising in the Middle East, where people were using Facebook and social media channels that couldn't be shut down necessarily by government entities, how responsible is the platform for combating that disinformation and making sure it doesn't appear? For IPR, I mean, we're always happy to share our research and always happy to share like some of the guides for how to combat disinformation, or here are some things that people need to consider. So Treaty, if you have any ideas for, I'm not turning this on you, but if you have any ideas for how we can get it out so people can understand, you know, what is a good source of information? I mean, we are always open to that because that's where the change happens. And that's where people's lives, it's a huge difference in people's lives and saving lives. So that's, but it's really scary at the same time, and it's not going to get better. That's the frightening aspect, especially as people cut off sources of information and say, this government source is the reliable source, that it's the only one you can count on, like what's happening in Russia. That's where it gets scary as hell.
Terry, Dave, anything you want to add? I know in Canada, you have speak a few different languages. So any variants on Tina's suggestions?
No, I think it's trying to find ways, especially in public health crisis. We note that our public health agencies are now translating most of their communications in well over 75 different languages in Toronto, but it would vary across the country as well, knowing that the only way that they can effectively get that message into those communities, racialized, marginalized communities, is to be able to speak with them in their own terms and languages. And then also finding credible sources within those communities that can be able to help carry that message across the groups as well.
The other thing that I hope will happen, we're still waiting to see. Terry and I just presented this information at the Worldwide Independent Network of Market Research Companies. And a number of our South American and Latin American partners we're having discussions with them launching a similar study in their countries. So not only will this be a look at North America, or Canada, US, but it'll be a look across the Americas. And what does this mean? So in be able to communicate this in Spanish and Portuguese as well. We're hoping to do that within the next year.
Awesome, thank you. Catherine Blades has another excellent question. And her question is, has the media created this lack of trust to themselves? For example, the pit in the center of the bottom of the Washington Post offices expressly there so that they can change headlines, or clickbait in real time to drive clicks to stories. Terry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Of course, because the economic model of most of newspapers, TV has been impacted by social, right? When you look at the amount of drive, I heard this from a very respected friend of mine who is a columnist with one of the leading papers in Canada. He's a business journalist, and he gets incentivized by the number of people that he can drive to his column and pay the subscriptions to get that as well. So he wasn't proud of that, but he said, look, this is the only way we can survive. The economic model for walled journalism today makes it impossible for these papers to do their job. So I think that's a worrisome perspective, but I think we need to maybe more transparency about what they're doing and why they are in fact incentivizing that way.
Tina?
It's also, I wouldn't say it's research for nefarious purposes. So a lot of these companies, are, like Catherine said, they're tracking headlines, which ones are work. They're doing a lot of A/B testing. They can tell where you stop reading and they can change the article. There's all sorts of that. Dave may see different articles than I do because of how it's filtered. So if these news organizations, if some of these disinformation sources, social media platforms weren't getting paid to spread disinformation, they wouldn't do it, right? If someone said, we're going to put our foot down and say, we're not spending any more money, right? Like what's happening with Twitter with Elon Musk taking over, right? Where they're like, we're not doing any more advertising. That's what's going to spark. So but then it's other revenue sources that they'll generate. But absolutely, it's also the news channels, the breaking news, but that drives advertiser dollar. It's all what we've created with ourselves, which means we're left with few sources of information that are transparent, that have our best interest in mind as the watchdogs of our democracy, really.
Dave, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think they've got it pretty clear on this one.
Oh, awesome. If there's anything that I would like to add, I often tell the IPR audiences, I'm a reformed marketer. And with this is what I noticed as a marketer is big data became something owned a lot of times by marketing. And with more information is going to come more disinformation. And the monetizing of something that when I was growing up was a loss leader, which was news and correct news, has definitely contributed to this. So my short answer to this question would be yes, news journalism has contributed to their own demise in this way because more information has led to, and monetization of that information has led to much more disinformation. Thank you for that question, Catherine. And the next question that I would like to ask the panel is, who can stop? I know we've touched on this a little more, but I would like for you all to go a little bit deeper into this. Who can stop disinformation now that it's so widespread? Dave, I'm going to start with you.
The number one source that we're hearing, according to our respondents, is it comes down to journalists, though. So I mean, we're just saying that the model needs to change, but it is journalists, it's my local government, and it's my political leaders. So we're really taking guidance from what we see and what we hear. But that being said, I was in New York last week watching lots of US news on this upcoming election. And depending on what channel, I listened to political leaders telling me stories, the exact same story in two different ways and two different viewpoints. So if we're still putting our trust and our faith that maybe political institutions and journalists will help us out of that, it's time for them to step up and follow along to help us get there.
Terry.
Well, I'm thinking the potential for governments to play a more activist role in Canada is certainly real. That wouldn't happen in the United States because Americans live by this notion of freedom of speech, and that buyers should beware and people should be wary of their information. But I think in Canada, governments certainly have an ability to be able to look at the influence of bots and automated news, and the Canadian Radio and Television Commission right now is looking at Bill C-11, which is the new Broadcasting Act, and Bill C-18, which is the Libel Copyright Act as well. And so I think you could see more activism coming from governments on a national level to be able to legislate against these kind of actions as well.
Tina?
I think it's up to us as people I don't think disinformation wouldn't get spread if we didn't, I mean, it would, but it wouldn't get spread to the extent if we didn't have people sharing it, which is driving up the clicks and driving up the use. And then it also is reliant on the social media platforms to also make sure, and I know they spend a ton of money, some of them doing content moderation, but it's how best can they, because they're also the ones who spread a lot of it now that we have sort of everyone can post things and everyone has access to content. So
I just want to share an anecdote. Last week, I had the opportunity to go represent this panel at the SPJ conference, the Society of Professional Journalists. And the panel that I was on was moderated by Dr. Bailey Shaw. And she shared a story about how personal responsibility plays a role. And that is that her parents are originally from China, and the sources that they trust are in their native language. And so Dr. Shaw plays a great role in being able to say, no, this isn't the correct information. And it goes to what you're saying, Tina, in terms of we have a responsibility, individual responsibility to stop spreading disinformation. If we come across something that we know isn't true, you can stop the spread by just choosing not to share it. A good friend of mine always reminds me of this: not everyone is entitled to your opinion, Anetra. And we have that on social media. And sometimes your opinion aligns directly with something that isn't necessarily correct. So that would be my thoughts on that. And this is going to be our last question for this session. How do communicators fight against the lack of trust in institutions that's directly tied to misinformation and disinformation? Tina, I'm going to start this one with you.
Sure. I know I'll keep it brief. It's being a trusted source yourself. So making sure that you're transparent with why you're doing things, being a good steward of information, training your employees, right? Showing that you really care, that clearly we talk about mental health and how it affects us. This disinformation affects everybody, regardless of your political leaning. So if you want to help people feel better, how can you help them feel better? It all ties into, and it's, saves the organization money in the long run. So there's a lot of things organizations can do. You're also welcome to talk to me, and I have lots of opinions. So,
Dr. Flynn.
So I would suggest that they go to our Behavioral Insights Research Center and look at a number of articles that we've written on credible sources as well, in terms of what characteristics a credible source should have. And so organizations need to find people who are credible, and it's that credibility, that's one-on-one interpersonal credibility, that we in fact gain more positive reputation for organizations as well. And as Tina talked about it's that they're relatable, they're transparent, they have effective communication skills, they're trustworthy, they're empathetic as well. And so finding people that are trustable is a way to build that trust within organizations.
Dave.
I'm going to go back and start a little earlier than people within our company and employees. And I'm going to say that this should be a regular source of education at the high school level of all new citizens as they're starting to grow up. How do I, we learn about democracy, we learn about the importance of it, but learning about the importance of transparent news and proper sources and how to not spread disinformation. It's a longer range plan, but I think it's an important thing to look at. And it's a group that already is a little more cocky in terms of they think they've got a handle on it in our study, but at the same time, they're still spreading disinformation, maybe not at the rate as other populations, but let's start with the youth.
Awesome. Well, it has come to time, and I want to thank you all, Dr. Tina McCorkindale, Dr. Terry Flynn, Dave Scholz of Legere, McMaster, IPR, and thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you, Reagan, for hosting Comms Week and asking us to do this panel. We ask that you take a look at all of the resources that have been dropped in the link as you commit to combating disinformation. And we wish you the best of health tomorrow, those of you in America on election night. And thanks for joining us today. The replay will be available to you soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.